The voice on the other end of the line was calm, measured, and absolutely unmistakable, the kind of voice you hear maybe twice in a career if you're lucky, and my stepfather was holding the phone to his ear, turning the colour of old chalk. Let me back up. I'm 32 years old. I work as a Senior Policy Analyst for the Department of National Defence in Ottawa, which sounds important. And it is. But it's also the kind of job that means nothing to anyone at a Christmas dinner table in Barrie, Ontario. It means nothing to my stepfather anyway. To him, I've always been the daughter who moved away to push paper for the government, while he, a man who'd spent 30 years managing a mid-sized plumbing supply company, considered himself the real authority on how the world worked. My mother had been with him for 12 years. I'd been polite. I'd been patient. I'd driven 3 hours up the 400 every Christmas like clockwork, with wine I picked out carefully and gifts I wrapped myself, because my mother loved Christmas and I loved my mother. That's the only reason I kept coming back. Not for him. His name was Gary. Gary Kowalski. He had opinions about everything and knowledge of almost nothing, which is a particular kind of dangerous at a dinner table. That Christmas, I almost didn't go. I'd been in the middle of a sensitive file. I can't go into details, but the kind of work that meant my BlackBerry-issued government device needed to stay on my person at all times over the holiday period. My supervisor, a woman I respected enormously, had been clear, stay reachable. So I drove up on the 24th, government phone in my bag, personal phone in my pocket, planning to stay exactly 36 hours and drive back down before the roads got bad. My mother had made her usual spread, tortilla, which she'd adopted from a neighbour years ago and now claimed as a family tradition. Roasted potatoes. A standing rib roast she'd spent 2 days brining. The house smelled like butter and pine, and for about 20 minutes after I arrived, things were almost nice. Then Gary came downstairs. He'd been having a pre-dinner drink since noon, which meant by the time we sat down at 6, he was on his 4th or 5th scotch, and his voice had taken on that particular loudness that I'd learned, over 12 years, meant trouble was coming. So, he said, cutting into his meat without looking up, still at the same department? Still at DND, yes. He chewed. Swallowed. My buddy Dale, you know Dale from the Lions Club, his kid just made director at a private firm in Toronto, 29 years old, $240,000 a year. Good for Dale's kid, I said. I'm just saying. Private sector. That's where the real work gets done. Not shuffling paper for Trudeau. My mother made a small sound, half laugh, half plea, and reached over to adjust the salt shaker that didn't need adjusting. That was her move. That was always her move. Gary, she said quietly, I'm just having a conversation, Lynn. I picked up my fork and decided to eat my tortilla and say nothing. I'd learned that strategy too. The less I engaged, the sooner he ran out of material. It almost worked. We'd made it through dinner and were sitting in the living room, my mother and I on the couch, Gary in the armchair with another drink, when my government phone buzzed. Not a call, a secure message alert. I pulled it out of my bag and glanced at the screen. My stomach tightened. I typed a quick acknowledgement response and set the phone face down on my knee. Gary noticed. You bring your work phone to Christmas, he said. I'm on call this week. On call, he repeated, like I'd said something funny. For what? You going to rush back and file something? Push an urgent memo? He laughed at his own joke. My mother smiled faintly. I said nothing. The phone buzzed again. I picked it up, read the message, and knew immediately I needed to step outside to make a call. The situation had escalated, not dramatically, not yet, but enough that my supervisor needed to loop me in on a briefing call in the next 10 minutes. I started to stand up. Where are you going? Gary asked. Outside. Work call. It's Christmas Eve. I'm aware. You know what your problem is. He leaned forward in his chair. The scotch sloshed in his glass. You've let that job make you think you're more important than you are. You sit up there in Ottawa in your little government office, and you think you're doing something that matters, but nobody outside that bubble cares. You're a middle manager with a fancy title. I stopped, turned around. Gary, I really don't want to do this tonight. I'm not doing anything. I'm just telling you the truth. Your mother worries about you, you know. 32, no partner, no kids, driving back and forth for a job you can't even talk about at dinner because I'm not allowed to. Not because there's nothing to talk about. Convenient, he said. My phone buzzed again, 3 times in quick succession. I looked down at the screen. It was a call now, not a message. The number was a secure government line. I needed to answer it immediately. I have to take this, I said. I was halfway to the front hallway when Gary stood up. You've been on that phone all night. You walk in here, you barely say hello to your mother, and you're attached to that thing like it's your lifeline. It is my lifeline tonight, Gary, that's the point. And then he reached out and took the phone out of my hand. It happened fast. He was bigger than me and drunk, and I was caught off guard. I'd been mid-step, turning away from him, and his hand closed around the device and pulled it back before I could react. He held it up like a trophy. You can have it back in an hour. We're having Christmas Eve, Gary. My voice came out very flat, very controlled. Give me the phone, right now. Relax. 1 hour. Your government can survive without you for one. The phone was still ringing in his hand. The call hadn't disconnected. He looked at it. Then, with the particular arrogance of a man who has never once been genuinely wrong in his own mind, he pressed the green button and brought it to his ear. Hello, he said. The room went quiet. I watched his face. For the first 3 seconds, he was still in performance mode, the slight smirk, the posture of a man holding court. Then something shifted. His jaw tightened. He blinked once, slowly. The smirk evaporated. Pardon me, he said. More silence from his end. He was listening. The colour drained out of his face in a way I'd never seen happen to a person before. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had pulled a plug. He lowered the phone from his ear. His hand was trembling just slightly. I could see it from where I stood. He held the phone out to me. I took it. This is Meredith, I said. Meredith. My supervisor's voice was level but sharp underneath, the way it always got when she needed something done immediately. I need you on a briefing in 4 minutes. Is there a situation at your location? There was, I said, looking directly at Gary. It's resolved. Good. We'll dial you in now. And Meredith, the Deputy Minister is on this call. Make sure you're somewhere you can speak freely. Understood. Give me 60 seconds. I lowered the phone and walked to the front door. I put on my coat. I stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind me. The air was sharp and cold, snow coming down slow and thick over the street, the neighbours' houses lit up in blue and white along the cul-de-sac. I stood there in the quiet for a moment, just breathing. Then I took the call. I was outside for 45 minutes. The briefing was serious, focused, the kind of work that required my whole brain, and I gave it. By the time I came back inside, my cheeks were numb and my coffee had gone cold on the end table. Gary was still in the armchair. He wasn't drinking anymore. The glass was sitting on the side table untouched. My mother was on the couch, and the energy in the room had shifted entirely. I could feel it the moment I stepped through the door. She'd been talking to him, or he'd been sitting in silence. Either way, the loudness was gone. I sat down across from him and said nothing. He looked at me for a long moment. He had the look of a man who had just discovered that the floor he'd been standing on confidently for years was actually a trapdoor. Not ashamed yet, Gary Kowalski wasn't built for shame. Not quickly, but shaken. "Who was that?" he said. His voice was different, quieter. My supervisor. She said she was calling from... She said there was a deputy minister on the line. There was. He worked his jaw. She said something about... She said I had just interrupted a call with national security implications. Yes, I said. Is that true, Gary? I picked up my cold coffee. I've been trying to tell you for 3 years that my work is not pushing paper. You chose not to believe me. That's not something I can fix tonight. Your mother didn't know, he said, with the strange, desperate energy of a man trying to distribute the embarrassment somehow. I know she didn't. I don't talk about work at home. That's by design, not because there's nothing to talk about. I looked at my mother. She had the expression she always got when she was trying to figure out how to feel about something, mouth slightly pressed together, eyes moving between me and him. Mum, I'm sorry tonight was like this. It wasn't what I wanted. Don't apologize, she said quietly. She said it to me, but she looked at Gary when she said it. He noticed. I saw it register. I stayed that night. The roads were bad by 11 and it wasn't worth the drive. I slept in my old room, which my mother had kept as a guest room with new curtains and a proper duvet. And I lay in the dark, listening to the snow hit the window, and thought about how much energy I'd spent over 12 years managing that man's perception of me. How many dinners I'd absorbed his commentary on my salary, my choices, my apartment in Westboro, my decision not to have children yet, my government job, my everything. I thought about how tired I was. The next morning, Christmas Day, I came downstairs early. Gary was already in the kitchen. He was making coffee, the real kind in the percolator, the way my mother liked it. He didn't say anything when I came in. I pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. He set a mug in front of me without being asked. We sat in silence for a while. The snow was still coming down outside. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the leftover tourtière my mother would reheat for breakfast. I owe you an apology, Gary said finally. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at his coffee. I've been dismissive. For a long time. I didn't say anything. I waited. I didn't know, he said. About your work. I assumed. I know what you assumed. He was quiet again. Then I made your mother uncomfortable last night, and I embarrassed myself. There it was. Not the apology I deserved, exactly. The one that acknowledged 12 years of snide comments and backhanded comparisons, and the slow erosion of dinners I'd driven 3 hours to have. But it was the only kind Gary Kowalski had in him, and I was old enough to know the difference between demanding the full apology and accepting the one that was actually going to happen. You did, I said, simply, without cruelty. He nodded once, drank his coffee. My mother came downstairs at 8, and the three of us had breakfast, reheated tourtière and coffee, and a clementine each because that was the tradition. Clementines in the toes of the stockings, left over from when I was small. Gary was quieter than usual. Not sullen quiet, the kind that fills a room with resentment. Just smaller somehow, like he'd let some air out. After breakfast, I called my supervisor to follow up on the file. She updated me briefly, and at the end of the call she said, "Everything all right there? You were outside a long time last night." "Family situation," I said. "It's handled." "Good. Merry Christmas, Meredith." "Merry Christmas." I drove back to Ottawa on Boxing Day, the highway clear and the sky white and flat the way it gets after a big snow. I had the radio on, a country station out of Barrie that faded out somewhere around Bradford, and then just the road and my thoughts. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. That's the thing nobody tells you about moments like that. They don't feel like victory. Gary hadn't been publicly humiliated. There'd been no dramatic confrontation, no explosive revelation. My supervisor's voice on the other end of that phone had said, quietly and precisely, enough for him to understand that the woman he'd been writing off for 12 years was sitting across from him at Christmas dinner and doing work he couldn't imagine, and that would have to be enough. It wasn't everything, but it was something. I passed the Bradford interchange and the country station gave way to static, and I let it play, that quiet fuzz, all the way down to the 401. 3 weeks later, I got a promotion. Senior advisor. New position, more responsibility, a significant salary increase that brought me, I noted privately, comfortably above what Dale's kid from the Lions Club was making in the private sector. I didn't tell Gary. My mother told him, I think eventually. She mentioned in passing during a call in February that he'd asked how my new role was going. That was enough too. I still think about Gary's face in that moment, the colour leaving it, not slowly but all at once, like the confidence he'd carried for 12 years, just drained out through the floor. And I've turned it over many times since, trying to figure out what I actually feel about it. Not triumphant, not vindicated exactly, something quieter than that. The thing about people like Gary is that they're not cruel in a calculated way. He genuinely believed what he said about me, that my work wasn't real, that my choices were somehow a soft version of a real life, that a woman driving back and forth to Ottawa for a government job she couldn't discuss at dinner was probably hiding the fact that there wasn't much to discuss. He built a whole story about who I was, and he'd been telling it to himself for so long that it had become fact to him. That's what made it so exhausting. You can't argue with a story someone's already decided is true. What I've come to understand is that I never needed to argue. I just needed to keep doing the work. There's something about that, about the quiet persistence of just continuing to be competent day after day in ways that most people around you will never see, that I think doesn't get talked about enough. It's not glamorous. It didn't feel like strength in the moment. It just felt like stubbornness and loneliness sometimes, and the particular fatigue of being underestimated by someone who is also sitting across from you at Christmas dinner. But it was something. It was the most honest thing I had. I think about my mother too. Lynn, who loved Christmas and made tourtière and adjusted salt shakers that didn't need adjusting when the air in the room got tight. She wasn't a weak person. She was a person caught between two people she loved, trying to keep peace the only way she knew how. I don't hold it against her, but I've thought a lot about what it costs to prioritize peace over truth. Over time, it cost her 12 years of watching her daughter be dismissed at her own dinner table. I don't think she calculated that. What carries a person through something like this? What carried me isn't a dramatic moment of vindication, though those happen sometimes. It's the slower, quieter work of knowing who you are when someone is actively trying to tell you that you're less. It takes a kind of integrity to not let that in, to hear it year after year and not start to believe it, to keep driving the 3 hours anyway, keep doing the job, keep being decent to someone who isn't being decent to you, not because you're a pushover, but because you've decided that your values don't depend on his behavior. The promotion came 3 weeks later. I didn't announce it. I didn't need to. Gary asked my mother how my new role was going in February. She told me in passing. That was the whole thing. No confrontation, no grand scene. Just a man quietly revising his assumptions about a woman he'd underestimated for a decade, in a kitchen in Barrie, Ontario, in winter. It's enough. Most real reckonings look like that. Not a thunderclap, just a slow realization arriving somewhere cold and quiet with nobody watching.